Great. Well, welcome everyone. And thank you so much for joining us for this online event on gender, climate, and security in the Horn of Africa. So my name is Alex Fisher. I'm a senior research manager for the Cross-Border Conflict Evidence Policy and Trends Research Program, also known as XCEPT. Before we kick off today's discussion, just a quick bit of background on XCEPT and some housekeeping. Start with the housekeeping first. So first, this event is being recorded. And the recording will be made publicly available afterwards. Second, if you have any questions for our speakers today, please write them into the chat function on Zoom or the Q&A function. During the Q&A, you won't be able to ask your question verbally, so you'll need to write your questions. You can also submit questions verbally if you'd like. And then finally, we'll be dropping an anonymous feedback form in the chat box towards the end of the event. So if you have a couple minutes free, we'd be really grateful if you could fill that out. Now, just to give a quick introduction to XCEPT and to today's discussion. So if we go to the next slide. So XCEPT is one of the UK government's flagship conflict research programs. It's funded by UK International Development. And as our name suggests, our focus is on conflict-affected borderlands and how conflicts connect across borders, as well as what that means for responding to conflict. Next slide, please. As you can see, we cover a very broad geography, all the way from the Sahel across Africa to the Middle East, and then to South and Southeast Asia. And we're expanding into new regions as well. Below are our core partners, those who are doing long-term research on the program. But we also bring in many more partners through the XCEPT Research Fund, which is our agile commissioning platform. Next slide, please. So in this XCEPT webinar series, we're bringing together several of our XCEPT Research Fund awardees who've been thinking about better ways to respond to conflict and its transnational dimensions. They've each been doing research on multi-actor interventions in transnational conflict contexts. And their projects examine coalition, multilateral, and coordinated interventions in Africa and the Middle East. And they tackle a diverse set of themes, ranging from conflict, climate, gender, violent extremism, and peacekeeping. They use a range of tools, including mixed methods field data collection, remote methods, and machine learning. And this is the 6th webinar in the series. So to find out about the other events in the series and other research projects, please have a look at the XCEPT website or sign up to our newsletter. So about today's event. The links between climate change and cross-border conflict are gendered, yet much of the research on gender, climate, security, and nexus remains narrowly focused on the impacts on women and girls, framing them as victims rather than as agents of change. In today's webinar, researchers from Bodhi Global Analysis will explore findings from their XCEPT research on how climate change and conflict are changing gender roles in the Horn of Africa. They'll also provide lessons learned from cross-border programs focused on the nexus and consider policy implications. The research project was led by Albert Mully. So Albert is the head of conflict and peace building at Bodhi Global Analysis, brings experience in conflict and political economy analysis, stabilization and peace building, and previously worked as a conflict advisor at the UK's Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, or FCDO, and the Department for International Development, or DFID. Our moderator today will be Dr. Anna Louise Strahan. So Anna is one of the founders of Bodhi. She has over 13 years of experience in conducting conflict, gender, and political economy analysis, with field experience across sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. She holds a PhD in international relations, with an MSc in Asian politics and a BA in Middle Eastern studies. Finally, we're also joined by Hilary Owinyo. So Hilary is Bodhi's senior monitoring, evaluation, and learning specialist who worked on this project and has 9 years of experience conducting social and economic research in the development and humanitarian sectors. He's worked with both local and international organizations on a range of issues, with field experience in Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, Nigeria, and Liberia. So thanks very much to our speakers. I'm going to turn it over to Anna to kick us off.
Thank you everyone for joining today. So the research that we're presenting focuses on 2 regions that have been very much affected both by multiple forms of violence and conflict and by climate change. So the research looked at the Mandera Triangle, the area between Ethiopia, Somalia, and Kenya, and also at the border between Southwest Ethiopia and Kenya, and specifically there, South Omo and Turkana. So Today we will be hearing, as Alex said, about the nexus between gender, climate change, and conflict, and how women's roles have changed in the face of the challenges brought by those two factors, conflict and climate change, in the target areas. I'm going to hand over to Albert now to present the findings from the research, and then we'll open up for questions later on.
Thank you, Anna. Next slide, please. I think you can also skip this one because Anna covered that. Yeah, I mean, this is just a map of where we conducted the research. So we looked at, first of all, thanks for joining. I'm Albert. I'm the head of conflict and peace building at Bodhi. So just before I jump into the findings, I just wanted to quickly cover the geographical area that we covered in the research, as well as the analytical framework that we use. So we wanted to focus on two geographical areas, two cross-border conflict systems in the Horn of Africa. One being the Mandera Triangle, which is where the borders of Kenya, Somalia, and Ethiopia converge. And the other one being the Southwest Ethiopia, Northwest Kenya border, which is where South Omo in Ethiopia and Turkana converge. And these are areas where livelihoods are very much connected and conflict systems as well. So there's a lot of shared socioeconomic, political, and environmental factors across those borders. Next slide, please. As Anna said, the main purpose of the research was to really try to understand the role that gender plays as a moderating variable linking the relationship between climate hazards and conflict risk. So we developed a analytical framework that would allow us to really clearly set out what the different factors that we were examining are, and to link that to policy implications for multi-actor interventions across those three areas, but also to look at it from an integrated perspective. So we're looking at, how do climate adaptation, gender transformative, and peace building programs, how did they consider the intersection between climate, gender, and conflict, and what lessons we could discern and what policy implications we could distill from our research. So next slide, please. The research, we managed to produce many findings, but I would say that the four main findings that we want to present to you today are as follows, and we will go into them one by one after, but I just wanted to quickly cover the four overall findings so that you have them at the front of your mind. The first one is that, and this won't surprise many of you, climate change can contribute to natural resource conflict in cross-border areas. But in the areas that we focus on, we identified four indirect causal pathways. So people who are familiar with the climate security evidence base and research conducted to date will know that the general consensus is that climate change is a multiplier of conflict, is not a direct causal factor, but that it can contribute to and it can enhance and multiply pre-existing conflict drivers. And therefore, the linkage is indirect and it's highly contextual, and it's also not linear. But in the four areas that we looked at, in the two areas that we looked at, we identified four causal pathways, and I will cover them later. The second finding, and this touches directly on the kind of overall research question that we looked at, is that women in these areas, yes, they are victims of conflict and they do disproportionately suffer from the indirect impacts of conflict, specifically those related to livelihoods and socioeconomic impacts. But women are not just passive victims of conflict, which is what a lot of the research has focused on to date. Women actively engage in conflict, but this engagement is itself shaped by gender norms. And so we really wanted to understand the different roles that men and women play in conflict. But also we wanted to understand the role that men and women play in natural resource management and in addressing natural resource-based conflict. And our third finding is that basically, despite women's conflict roles, and despite many men recognizing that women play a key role in conflict and that women play a key role in natural resource use and production. They have an intimate knowledge of natural resources. They have an intimate knowledge of conflict dynamics, but because of gender norms, they are not really allowed to play much of a decision-making role. So, that kind of tells us a lot about the fact that, gender norms do prevail, and don't necessarily mean that just because a woman is involved in conflict, that it then gives her space to be involved in resolving that conflict. And then the last and final finding, which is the one that we think is the most important here, is that the impacts of climate change are contributing to changing gender roles in communities in both conflict systems, by driving women to take on responsibilities that are traditionally associated with men. And I'll touch later on what the implications of this are, or what this might mean in different locations. So next slide, please. So we'll now look at the first finding, as I mentioned, which is around the indirect relationship between climate change and natural resource conflict. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, we identified 4 main causal pathways through which climate change and the impacts of climate change indirectly contribute to conflict in the 2 cross-border areas that we studied. So the first one is that by increasing resource scarcity, primarily land-based resources and water-based resources, climate change is fueling out-group conflict and raising the risk of violence as a means to secure access to vital resources. So as I mentioned, the livelihoods of the communities in these cross-border regions are closely tied to natural resources. They depend on natural resources for their livelihoods as a source of income, for energy, for food, and climate impacts, primarily flooding and drought, is increasing the scarcity of many of these resources. And yes, this varies over time and in different locations, but in areas where this is happening, we found evidence that it changes the calculus, and so people become a lot more competitive. They focus on safeguarding the survival of their group and their group's access to those resources, which in turn raises the risk of violence because they're more willing to turn to violence and mobilize for violence to defend their access to those resources. And we see many cases of this, and this is something that has been increasingly well researched. The second pathway also won't surprise people because it's something that we see across the Horn of Africa, which is that resource scarcity and extreme climate events like flooding and drought changes the configuration of where natural resources are available. So particularly for pastoralists, it means that they've often had to change their transhumance pattern. So their cattle migration patterns have to change because they can't access the resources they traditionally have been able to. And this in turn is increasing the risk of conflict because it's bringing groups into contact that don't have pre-established conflict management mechanisms with each other, which means that the risk of conflict then is enhanced because they don't really have the means or aren't used to or don't have the trust there to be able to manage those conflicts that arise and therefore avoid violence. The third pathway is that the impacts of climate change are inducing migration. And so we're seeing people leaving certain areas and including moving as far as, in Mandera, we see people moving as far as Nairobi. And that means that often then other groups with whom they have conflict locally over land particularly will then try to take over and grab land from the people that have left. And that in itself has triggered conflict because the remaining members of the community of the people who had left then tried to defend that land grabbing, and this has sparked conflict. And then the last pathway is that by disrupting livelihoods through increased resource scarcity, climate change is forcing a lot of pastoralists to diversify their livelihoods. And in some locations, like around the Turkana Lake area, we've seen that pastoralists are turning to agriculture around the lake and turning to fishing, which is bringing them into competition with people that have already been fishing there locally for a much longer time. And we've seen many instances of violence as a result of that. So next slide, please. The second finding, as I said, pertains specifically to the role that women play in conflict. So as I said, women are not just passive victims of conflict, but we found evidence that they actively engage in conflict, albeit in a different way to men. Next slide, please. Crucially, we need to understand that women and men engage in conflict differently. Men do play a more active, direct role in the sense that they're the ones who hold the arms and they're the ones who actually directly perpetrate violence, which means that men are also therefore the ones that are more directly victims of fatalities directly related to conflict-related violence. However, we found a lot of evidence that women play a big role in mobilizing for violence by singing songs, by shaming men, by encouraging their husbands and brothers and other family members to engage in violence, particularly in cases where a community suffers violence at the hand of another community. Women play a big role in mobilizing men to fight and shaming men who don't want to fight, including standing up to and shaming elders who are trying to say that the community should actually try to find a peaceful resolution. We found evidence that women will very publicly go against those elders and try to shame them and say, by kind of traditional gender norms around the fact that to be a man means to use violence to defend the community, and trying to embarrass men who don't want to use violence. Another way in which we found that women engage in conflict is that they will mobilize resources specifically ahead of or during cycles of violence. They will provide shelter for men in different ways. And they'll write songs, they'll put on plays, and they'll make, again, jokes to try to influence and to build a kind of a culture to encourage the men to fight. So again, to us, this was really crucial because it dispels this idea that women are just victims of violence, that yes, violence does and conflict does increase the risk of women suffering sexual and gender-based violence. And it does increase the risk that, by affecting the access to key resources, conflict, and women will suffer because they're the ones in charge of the household, and so there's additional pressure on them to find the resources to feed their families. But this doesn't then mean, I think this idea of women as passive victims always meant that it created this implication that women just want peace and that women are naturally inclined towards peace and men are naturally inclined towards conflict. Whereas I think, our research shows that really that gender stereotype doesn't hold, and that many women do engage often in conflict and mobilizing for conflict, but as I said, in a different way than men. Next slide, please. So the next big finding was that despite women's conflict roles and their intimate knowledge of natural resources, because they're the ones using those resources to feed their families, to produce food, etc., they have a limited role in decision making. Next slide. And this comes down to basically the prevailing patriarchal gender norms that are part of the way that communities govern themselves and that govern the relations between men and women and govern the role that men and women can play in the domestic and the public domains. So, basically women's roles are seen as domestic, even though we see that in conflict, in situations of conflict, they play a very public role inciting conflict and encouraging men to fight. But when it comes to decisions around how communities will use natural resources and whether communities will sue for peace in situations of conflict, women are then relegated to the domestic realm only and not seen as relevant actors in general. And this is what we found in the communities that we spoke to. And I think the key issue here is to highlight that this is a loss for communities. Again, because women do have an intimate knowledge of natural resources. They are the ones who are collecting and using natural resources like firewood, water, agricultural products, etc. And so, not having women involved in decision making around how those resources are managed and used is a kind of missed opportunity when it comes to the development and the safeguarding of natural resources for those communities. Next slide, please. And this brings us to the final finding, which I think is the most kind of important one, and one that I think opens a lot of area for future research and continued policy debate, which is that we actually see that the impacts of climate change are contributing to changing gender roles. Next slide. So we're seeing that climate change and conflict and their compounded impacts. So, climate change on its own, climate-induced conflict, and their compounded impacts are driving men to stay away from their communities for much longer periods of time as they search for pasture and water further afield, but also as they stay away from home for longer periods during conflict, or because they have to leave their communities to engage in conflict more often. So overall, the net impact here is that men are away from home for longer periods of time and more frequently. As a result, we're seeing that women are being forced to step into the head of household role, taking on responsibilities that have been traditionally associated with men, and doing so more often and for longer periods of time. We're also seeing, and this was across the board, that because of climate change and because of climate-induced conflict, the number of widows has increased, which has driven not just this temporary rise in women playing the head of household role, but in the case of widows, a larger number of women in that role permanent as kind of female-headed households. So the number of female-headed households has been increasing. So as I said, consequently, this means that women have increasingly taken on new responsibilities in natural resource management, including pasture conservation, rearing of household livestock, engaging in fishing, and engaging in income generation activities that they probably wouldn't have, or our research found that they wouldn't have as much engaged in before this new pattern where men are staying away for longer. And so that means that by taking on these new responsibilities, women are actually having to take decisions related to how natural resources are being used. And that includes decisions around the use of water, land and soil use, and even kind of rangeland management and conservation in some cases. So I think, the main thing to take away here is that, climate change, yes, it can be, yes, it has many negative impacts. We see increasing evidence of the fact that, negative climate change can impact livelihoods negatively. It can increase poverty. It can displace communities. As I mentioned, it has impacts, although indirectly, on conflict itself. But when it comes to the actual kind of the gender norms and the social norms and power relations in communities, all of these changes that climate change is creating is actually creating an opportunity for a shift in gender norms and in power relations within communities. Next slide, please. So, before we go into policy implications, I think the crucial thing to note here is that we saw many of the communities that we consulted, both men and women, see this change and the fact that women are taking on these additional responsibilities as an opportunity for them to play a greater role, not just in their household, but in their communities, especially in communities where there are a lot of female-headed households, especially at times of conflict where there is a larger population of women left in the community while the men are away fighting. And especially in a context in which young men have taken on greater decision-making responsibility and elders have lost a bit of their influence. And during fighting, the young men are away, and so you have the women left with the elders. So a lot of the women we consulted said, that they saw this as an opportunity for them to, when the men are away, play a bigger role in making decisions for the community, which, because of the frequency that men are away at, it means that, they're having a lot more longer term influence in the way that communities use natural resources. And then it creates more agency for women as a whole, which then means they can play a role in decisions around peace building. However, in other areas, this wasn't a uniform view. In other areas, women actually saw this as a burden. Taking on responsibilities isn't necessarily interpreted as a positive opportunity. In some cases, it's seen as a threat, and women are worried that this means they're going to have to do more in the community without any actual ultimate gain in their empowerment or their ability to make the decisions that affect their own lives and the lives of their family. So again, this isn't a uniform view, but to us, it means that, I think, and I'm going to go straight into policy implication 2, it means that there is something happening. There is a shift happening. And this is a shift that international engagement in these areas can take advantage of. And by adopting a more kind of gender transformative approach and going into designing and implementing programs with these changing dynamics on the ground in mind, international programming could actually contribute to shifting those gender roles and leveraging those to try to change gender norms. So by having women play a more active role in the community, making decisions, over time, this could potentially contribute to shifting gender norms, not just shifting gender roles. And we think that, our research shows that by going into it more cognizantly, that programming can go with the grain. And in situations where women already see this as potential, and where some of the men we spoke to saw this potential too, that they can engage in a way that contributes to that shift. And in areas where this is seen as a threat, I think the approach might need to be different, but there's also potential to turn it into an opportunity. But I think, the way to even do that is now linked to the first policy implication, which is that I think programs in these cross-border areas do need to adopt a multidimensional and integrated approach where, they're not just looking at the links between climate and security, but really putting gender at the center, not simply as an afterthought. Often you'll see long, complex program designs that there's one section at the end that says that we'll integrate gender. And I think our research shows that gender does matter. It shapes the way that power is distributed and interpreted, and the way that conflict and peace dynamics actually play out on the ground. And they also influence the way that climate change impacts these livelihood and conflict systems. So I think integrating gender into the gender climate nexus and really coming at it, looking at gender as a relevant variable is really crucial here. And I think bringing that into multidimensional integrated approaches that aren't just piecemeal, that aren't just looking at climate change or just looking at economic resilience or just looking at peace building, but programming that tries to understand that these issues all intersect and they need to be addressed in unison and together in an integrated manner. I think that our research really shows that is the way to address these issues, because piecemeal approaches just won't work. The third policy implication is that gender norms, we need to think about gender norms not just in terms of the role that women play, but also the fact that it dictates the role that men play, as was mentioned. So engaging with influential men to secure their buy-in and catalyze opportunities for addressing patriarchal norms is something that could help open these doors for capitalizing on the opportunities that climate change and climate-induced conflict are creating for shifting power relations between men and women, and opening space for women to play a stronger role in natural resource management and decision-making processes related to natural resources, but also in relation to conflict and peace building. I think one key implication is that we think that the gender climate security nexus should be integrated into international policy frameworks. The COP28 declaration that we saw that got everyone very excited, because it was the first time that a COP mentioned the links between climate and peace explicitly. It did call for gender-sensitive climate action, but it didn't go as far as I think we would have liked it to go. And I think future policy frameworks related to the links between climate and security should really take gender into account and really help set out an approach that considers the intersection between the three. And lastly, I think we were only able to kind of get this conversation started, or to continue the conversation. We're not the first ones doing research on this, but I think we really think that continuing to invest in more and more regular research on the intersection between gender, climate, and security is crucial, especially in an area where we have not that many women researchers. So supporting women researchers to be able to do this, to understand how gender roles and norms contribute to natural resource conflict and can shape the way that women engage in conflict and peace building, will be really important for us to be able to develop policies and programs that appropriately and adequately address the intersection between the three. Next slide. I think, yeah. Thank you. So sorry if that was quick, but now we would be very happy to get questions and comments from those participating. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for that presentation, Albert, and for sharing the research findings. So I can see that we already have a couple of questions. So we can start with the first one here, which is about the militarization of women. So the question reads, I see women in parts of Ethiopia and Kenya moving about with guns. Do you have any findings on this?
Hillary, you were in the field. I don't know if you have any comments on the Kenya side.
I was waiting for Anna to comment or to loop me in. Sorry about that. Yeah. So through our experience with this research, we did realize that there are a lot of activities that have been done to try and reduce the level of active conflict, particularly around militarization of conflict across the borders. Particularly women walking around or men walking around guns did not particularly come out strongly as an active situation ongoing, but was constantly referenced as some of the past activities that really moved the threshold of the violence to a higher scale. But a lot of committee work has been done to try and de-escalate the situation. Not to say that it's not happening, but I would say the threshold of that happening has significantly reduced, particularly around the programs that have been implemented by both governments to try and increase cohesion and reduce conflict. Again, these instances, from our experience, will also tend to rise based on the climatic changes. You'd find like the more drought is prolonged, then the more communities start becoming desperate towards resources, and therefore the struggle to kind of get scarcity, to kind of get served, get the limited resources, the struggle to compete for the limited resources rises, and yeah, violence kind of escalates along those lines.
Thank you very much, Hillary. Did you want to add anything to that, Albert, or are you happy with the answer? Great. Okay, I'll take the next question in that case. And this one reads, are there documented trends or data indicating a significant number of men permanently leaving their communities for reasons related to conflict or resource search, similar to the phenomenon of young people relocating to urban areas? And what impact does this have on women and gender roles within these communities?
So, I mean, I can come in there. So, as we mentioned, yes, we've seen a lot of evidence of men leaving the home, sometimes temporarily, to go, it's in pastoralist communities, to go look for pasture and for water, to go and raid other communities, to raid cattle, or to just attack other communities, either as a preemptive attack or as a revenge. But we're also seeing economic migration. So climate change, the impacts of climate change and conflict separately, but also together, is, as I said, driving resource scarcity, which is limiting economic opportunities and driving young men sometimes to leave and stay away in urban areas for long. And we see this in the Mandera County in Kenya. There were a lot of instances of that. And again, this means that women are often left permanently in the situation where they suddenly become the breadwinner of the family, and they need to play the role that the women traditionally play and the role that men traditionally play, while the men are away. Yes, men will return sometimes and bring money, for example, but the day-to-day management of the household remains with the women. And there are many cases in which decision making still remains then, or is handed over to the local authorities or to elders in the family or in the broader clan. But again, the more that this happens, and there are instances where women are then themselves taking decisions that would usually have been taken by the male head of household. And again, this is where we see that opportunity for changing the norms around women's roles.
So I actually have another question in relation to that. So related to the kind of men leaving, there is a question around whether those men then end up becoming emasculated when they spent long periods of time away from home, and then they return and then women have had to kind of step up and take control of the household.
I think that's a really good question. We didn't specifically look into that, so it's difficult for us to comment. I think there is something to that because of evidence from a lot of kind of situations of displacement and protracted refugee crisis, in which we do see evidence of men reporting a sense of emasculation or marginalization, especially when aid agencies contribute to programs focused just on women, and women are really kind of the primary audience for a lot of programming in those contexts, and men aren't able to play their traditional gender roles, right? So I think there could be something similar playing out here, but I think it would need additional research because we didn't directly find anything related to that.
Great, thank you. So the next one is more around recommendations. And the question reads, engaging influential men is vital, but would you share recommendations for practical application away from the traditional awareness raising sessions?
Yes. So one of the case studies that we did as part of our research was PACT, a project called XCEPT, which is a cross-border peace-building project led by PACT and some of its partners in the southwest Ethiopia, northwest Kenya border. And they have a really good approach, which is kind of multi-pronged. So the first thing that they do is they engage with women champions. So they already, again, they don't just try to bring together a committee of women that are randomly selected. They spent time to identify women that are already kind of influential. So as I said, we see that women play a role in encouraging men to fight, etc. But we can't, we have to personalize it when you really come to the local level. So some women are often playing a bigger role than others. Some women who are female heads of household have more influence over the other women, but also the men in their family. So they spent a lot of time trying to identify who are the women that are most influential in the community. And they created a kind of network of women champions on both sides of the border. And then they brought these influential women together to kind of learn from each other. So I think these women are then, and evidence from PACT itself shows that these women are then able to influence their sons and their husbands and other members of their families a lot more, because they have a lot more legitimacy and a lot more influence in their communities. So I think that's one way, is to find the right women who can influence men. The other way is to find the right men. So I think research from Conciliation Resources and International Alert, and people can look this up online. They've recently published over the last year research that they've done on practical applications that they've tried in different contexts. And they've seen success on engaging with men who are themselves champions. So there are men, and we found in our research, there are men who do want women to play a bigger role. There are men who see a benefit in women participating in decision making around natural resources, around peace building. So again, finding those men and engaging with those men, not just to raise awareness, but they already have the awareness, they already have the commitment to it. So identifying those men and getting those men to engage with other men and change the mind and influence and coax other men to also understand and appreciate the role that women can play and help create that space, I think is crucial. So again, I think a targeted, granular approach that is based on an understanding of who are the people who have actual power and influence on the ground, I think that would be the way forward.
Great, thank you. So the next one is about the link between organized crime, conflict, and climate change, and whether you observed similar shifts in the roles of women in illicit activity as you did kind of in more traditional forms of conflict.
Yeah, I'll speak to this particularly in the Mandela Triangle, where we do have some rampant incidents of insecurity. So some of the key informers mentioned that particularly because young men are often profiled by security installations, therefore they try and find a way to circumvent moving around. And through this, they kind of use young women as the porters to create the link between markets, let me say appliances and foodstuff that get ferried from then towns to the remote areas where the armed conflicts or rather than state actors are usually residing. So I find because women are less suspected as participants, there is a slightly increase, or rather there's an increase in women being used as porters and ferriers of these commodities, and the link between the open society and these non-state actors hiding in, let me say, the bushes or in those remote areas. So, and this is particularly common amongst younger women rather than their older counterparts.
Thank you very much, Hilary. Okay. Another question here. So in your findings, you suggest capitalizing on the changes to gender norms brought about by climate change. The other way around, do you see a way in which women can be more instrumental in climate change adaptation and sustainable land management?
Yes, definitely. So I think the research shows that women have an intimate knowledge of natural resources, often more than men. So they are the ones, again, they're the ones collecting firewood. They're the ones gardening. They're the ones collecting water. They're the ones traveling, further afield. So again, men might have more knowledge of livestock, not livestock health. But when it comes to gardening and vegetables and soil quality and water logging and all of these things, women do have a very intimate knowledge and understanding. And these are all elements that climate adaptation programming tends to capitalize on and try to strengthen. So I think and we saw both women and men recognizing that women's knowledge is crucial to enable communities to better manage their natural resources, to combat environmental degradation, and to build community resilience to climate change. Part of which includes managing resources in a way that is more sustainable, using techniques and different types of seeds, etc., that are climate resistant. So yes, I think the answer is that there is a greater role for women, but again, I think there's something keeping women from being able to play that decision-making role. And I think climate change itself being the driver of the changes that create the threat to communities is also the driver of opportunities for women to be able to play more of a role.
Great. So this one is around the livestock sector, and the question reads, particularly in the Kenyan context, how does the commercialization of the livestock sector fit into your findings?
Yeah, very interesting question. I can say there was sufficient evidence to speak to that, but that's from a broader context. Most of these are pastoralist communities, therefore, the culture or the cultural beliefs around livestock is more in terms of as a measure of wealth and stability of the clan rather than the commercialization aspect of it. Therefore, we did find that most communities would rather trust vast borders or trust vast areas to get more pasture to be able to sustain their livestock rather than see climate change as a negative aspect that impacts their own ability to get returns from their livestock. So much as I would say there is the livestock market that particularly impacts the pastoral communities, the northern and the northwestern region of the country, it does not play a significant role yet, according to our research, in terms of whether that drives or negates the extent of conflict in these cross-border areas.
Thank you, Hilary. So the next question is around kind of, the policy frameworks that might need to be created to address some of these issues. So the question reads, in areas where women feel there could be conflicts if they take on more responsibilities around the family, how do we go about creating gender policy frameworks that address this risk?
Sorry, could you repeat the question? Just so I'm
Sure. In areas where women feel there could be conflict if they take on more responsibilities around the family, how do we go about creating gender policy frameworks that target this?
So I think it was earlier this year, West Pokot in Kenya adopted a policy on peace and development, and I think what we want to see more is, because of the localized nature of climate change and the different localized dynamics around the way that gender, climate, and security issues intersect. I think that's the way to go. And in Kenya, specifically, given the decentralization process, I think we would need to see policies that aren't just sectoral, but climate change needs to be integrated across sector policies, whether it's livestock, climate adaptation, transport, etc. So I think gender needs to be the same, and gender should be treated. There should be policies specifically related to gender equality and women's empowerment and enshrining women's rights, which the Constitution and the kind of different legislative frameworks of all three countries that we studied have to a different degree. But gender also needs to be integrated into these sectoral policies. So I think the key here is for organizations working at the local level, engage with the county level government or the district or provincial government, depending on the country, to advocate for policy frameworks that integrate gender, that safeguard women's ability to play a stronger role. And I think this is already happening. I think one key thing the research found was that in Mandera, on the Kenyan side, compared to all the other countries, local authorities, because the government itself has been playing a more active role in peace building, and these kind of peace committees led by the government, they've tried to engage women more from a kind of normative perspective. And therefore, we did see a difference in the willingness of men in Mandera, or the way that they talked about women participating was much, I think, markedly different from the other areas. So I think this shows that over time, by putting women in a position of decision-making, even if initially it's tokenistic and it's just about ticking the box of having women in the peace committee, over time, people start to see that women contribute, women actually play a role, and it can shift roles and norms, right? So I think having policies that encourage that, but that also then go beyond ticking a box of women participating to actually encourage women to meaningfully shape policies and action plans and approaches, I think that would really be crucial. So I think advocating at the local level for gender mainstreaming in sectoral policies and programs, I think that's the way to go.
Great, thank you. I actually have a couple of other questions related to policy, so I'm going to take those first because they kind of follow on. So the first one is, did the research highlight any national policy levers that could most effectively be engaged? Government support, for example, to social policy or security provision? Those being the examples.
Honestly, we we focus because of the nature of XCEPT, we really wanted to look at international multi-actor interventions across these two border areas. So we focus on two case studies of internationally supported programs. I did have national partners, but we're primarily driven by the kind of NGO sector. So we didn't specifically look at national policies, although yes, there are many. And I think we would have to, I think, when we look at adapting some of our findings to specific local contexts, I think doing a mapping of existing policies, gaps in those policy frameworks, and then what the implications for our research are to addressing those gaps would be important. But it wasn't really within the scope of this research.
Thank you. And then the kind of next one related to this also is, have you interacted with the peace education policy of the Ministry of Education? I'm assuming that's Kenya's, but I'm not sure. And seen whether its implementation in border regions is addressing contextual issues like climate conflict?
I haven't, but Hillary, I don't know if you have any thoughts. Again, we didn't specifically look at that in this, but I think, yeah, Hillary, we didn't as part of this research. But again, this is research that we're not just going to write this and forget about it. We do want to build on it. So I do think this is really helpful as kind of inputs to help shape our continuing research on this agenda.
Great, thank you. The next one's quite long, so I'm going to try and break it down a little. So BIC also conducted research on the relationship between drought, food security, and violent conflict in northern Kenya, in Marsabit. And that research found that there is a long-term trend of sedentarization of pastoral groups, which seems to be a reaction to increasing climate change-related risks, but also to humanitarian action in food crises, existing governance structures, and infrastructure developments. So the gender roles thereby change in this context of an increasingly sedentary life, which gives new value to the land that is directly available, e.g. for cultivation, but also raises attention to translocal patterns of lives, split, separated, scattered families, etc. So the question related to this is then, can you rightly attribute climate change as the central driver of gender transformations, or isn't it rather that the sedentarization process is an indication of multiple drivers and wider socioeconomic change is responsible?
That's really interesting. And I think sedentarization as a policy and as a threat to the pastoral way of life, right? This has been a debate for decades now, is that governments in the Horn of Africa have been trying to pursue a kind of sedentarization policy for different reasons, but which threaten pastoralist communities' ability to adapt to climate change, because mobility, as we know, has been the main way through which these communities adapt to climate change. So I actually think it's the two. It's the fact that sedentarization hasn't fully happened, and therefore you have communities that are kind of more agro-pastoral. They haven't given up pastoralism yet. They still have heads of livestock, but they also have permanent households in communities that are sedentary, which creates a situation in which, again, men are going off to search for resources or to fight communities while leaving the women behind. Whereas maybe before migration patterns, the entire community would have moved at different points and over time in different frequencies. Yes, there might be times where men go without the women, etc. But I think it's actually a combination of the two. But what our research found was that the communities themselves reported that it is climate change why men are away from home more often. But I think we need to ask, why is there even a home in the first place? Were they always there? And so I do think sedentarization plays a part, but we didn't specifically look at it. So I think we would need additional research to really look specifically at the kind of the extent to which one has explanatory value over the other one.
Thank you. The next question is around the role that women play in instigating violence. So the question is, are women aware of the roles that they play in instigating violence? Have they been sensitized against this? And has this awareness been leveraged as an entry point for conciliation efforts and sensitization against conflict and violence?
Yeah, they're aware. Yeah, again, the women and the men that we spoke to said that they instigate violence for different reasons. Again, cultural traditional views around protecting the community against attacks or against the threat of attacks from rivals or against competition from rival groups to access resources. So yes, they're very aware. Whether this is then used, I think neither of the projects we looked at specifically used women's roles in conflict as an entry point for engaging with them. I think engagement with women on peace building is mainly driven by normative imperatives to, the fact that global evidence on the likelihood of peace holding longer when in cases where there's more gender equality or where women participate. I think that kind of evidence is what drives international programming implemented by NGOs or UN agencies to engage with women, because there is evidence that women's participation in peace processes makes them stronger and more sustainable. But I think this is where I think our research shows that in some ways is predicated on the assumption that women want just peace and that women don't themselves see value in conflict. And I think this is where our research is important, because we need to, policymakers and people designing programs and implementing programs need to go into it understanding that a lot of these women are themselves actors in conflict and are themselves instigating conflict. And we can't just assume automatically that women want peace. And so engaging with women as conflict actors and not just as peace actors, I think that's a very big difference in the way that you engage, and therefore in the theories of change that you're designing for your program, and the programs and the messaging that you use and your community engagement approach needs to take that into account, because you can't just assume that women, because they're women, like peace.
Thank you. I think in the interest of time, we're going to have to keep it to one more question. So the last question I'm going to ask is, was the research able to account for the non-economic loss and damages induced by climate and conflict crises in any capacity? Thinking along the lines of how research and policy can incorporate the gendered impacts of non-economic loss and damages, since it has major implications on societal and ecological welfare.
I'm not sure I'm not quite sure what they mean by non-economic loss. Could you repeat the question?
Yeah. Was the research able to account for the non-economic loss and damages induced by climate and conflict crises in any capacity? Thinking on the lines, and I think this is kind of the explanatory sentence, thinking along the lines of how research and policy can incorporate the gendered impacts of non-economic loss and damages, since it has major implications on societal and ecological welfare.
I mean, no, we didn't really specifically look at that. If by non-economic loss, they mean kind of biodiversity loss or land degradation, I think, yes, community respondents that we consulted mentioned that those issues as impacts of climate change. And again, they link the fact that women, because they're the ones engaging and using those resources, women understand. So I think there were specific examples. A few times people mentioned that women understand soil erosion. So they're the ones who know when soils reach the point where it can't really be used for agriculture or gardening anymore. And therefore, I think there is a link to that, or again, it provides an entry point for women to play a bigger role. But I think, yeah, we didn't specifically look into that in too much detail, so it's difficult for me to elaborate. Apologies.
Thank you so much. As we've reached the end of our time, I would like to thank everyone for attending. Thank you very much for those very interesting questions. I think they've really fed into our future research, as Albert has highlighted. We're definitely not going to, let this rest, and we'll continue to work on deepening our knowledge of these factors and taking it forward. So this has been extremely helpful. Thank you both, Albert and Hilary, for your fantastic responses, and to XCEPT for hosting the event.